1812, the tragic retreat from Moscow, a story of desperation, survival, and the fall of an empire. The year was 1812, and the vast plains of Russia lay beneath the cold, unforgiving skies. Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitious campaign to conquer Russia had begun in June, with over 600,000 soldiers marching across Europe. The Grand Army, an unstoppable force of soldiers, cavalry, and artillery, had made its way into the Russian heartland, hoping to crush Tsar Alexander I's empire. But as the weeks turned to months, what had seemed like a triumphant advance began to unravel, and the retreat from Moscow would become one of the most harrowing chapters in military history. The year began with hopes of swift victory, but the Russian army, using scorched-earth tactics, gradually withdrew, leaving the French forces without the necessary supplies. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, the city was abandoned and burning, set alight by the retreating Russians. Napoleon's hopes of a decisive battle were dashed. As he made his headquarters in the charred city, the once-unbeaten emperor found himself trapped in a fortress of fire and famine. The soldiers of the Grand Army, already exhausted and suffering from hunger and disease, were faced with another grim reality: winter was approaching. The freezing cold was not just a battle of the elements, it became a battle of survival. Napoleon's once proud army, a symbol of European dominance, began to crumble under the weight of its own ambition. The retreat begins. The retreat from Moscow began in mid-October, and it was marked by chaos, despair, and a sense of inevitability. The roads were littered with the bodies of the dead and dying, some from battle, but many from the harsh conditions, frostbite, starvation, and disease. Napoleon's once glorious forces, which had swept through Europe with astonishing speed, now limped back through the Russian wilderness in a desperate attempt to survive. One soldier, Sergeant Pierre Dupont, a French infantryman, later recalled his experiences in the retreat. At first, there was still a semblance of order. We marched, though we were weak from hunger and fatigue. But it didn't take long for the soldiers to begin to lose hope. The cold was unbearable. The frost bit at our faces, and every step became harder. We would hear the cry of a man in agony, his feet frozen to the ground, and we could do nothing for him. The further we went, the more we became like ghosts, our faces hollow from hunger, our eyes deadened by the despair of it all. Napoleon, ever the leader, tried to maintain some semblance of control over his forces, but it was clear that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. He sent out messengers to order his commanders to regroup, but they could offer little in the way of hope. Marshal Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted generals, was tasked with protecting the rear of the retreat, but his men were dwindling, and many of them were too exhausted to continue. The sufferings of the men. The retreat was not just a military disaster, it was a human tragedy. The soldiers, once proud and strong, were reduced to shadowy figures, scavenging for food in the snow. For many, the only sustenance came from the bodies of their fallen comrades, as the freezing cold made it impossible to bury the dead in time. Private Jean-Baptiste Leclerc, a young soldier from Paris, recalled the horrific conditions. "We had no choice but to march on. The officers said we had to keep moving. But how could we? We were starving, freezing, and broken. I saw men fall to the ground, their bodies shaking, and I knew they were dead. But we couldn't stop. We had to keep going, or we would all die out there in the wilderness." As the days wore on, the horrors of the retreat multiplied. The Grand Army, once a proud and disciplined force, was now a ragtag group of survivors, many of whom were barely able to walk, let alone fight. The cavalry, once the pride of Napoleon's army, was decimated. Horses were too weak to carry their riders, and many were slaughtered for food. The artillery, which had been so vital in Napoleon's previous victories, was abandoned as the soldiers scrambled to survive. The Russian winter, with its unrelenting cold, brought the final blow to Napoleon's forces. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, -34 degrees Celsius, and many of the soldiers simply froze to death where they stood. One soldier, Captain Augustin Moreau, remembered, "I will never forget the sound of men's screams as they froze. We could hear them through the night, their cries piercing the stillness of the snow-covered fields. I tried to help one man who had collapsed from frostbite, but his hands were frozen stiff, and he could not hold his musket anymore. I had to leave him behind. I thought of him every day after. The rearguard actions. As the French army began its retreat, Marshal Ney led a series of rearguard actions to slow down the Russian pursuit. But the Russians, under General Mikhail Kutuzov, were relentless. They harassed the French from all sides, picking off stragglers and forcing the retreating soldiers to keep moving with little rest. The most famous of these rearguard actions was at Berezina River, where the French forces attempted to cross the icy waters in late November. The French had constructed makeshift bridges, but the Russians were closing in fast. The battle that ensued was chaotic, with French soldiers fighting for their lives as the river's icy waters swallowed the injured and the desperate. It was here that General Ebel, one of Napoleon's engineers, sacrificed himself to help save the retreating soldiers. As his men struggled to keep the bridges intact, Ebel stayed behind to ensure the last of the troops could cross. He died shortly after, a hero to his comrades. The final collapse. By December, the remnants of Napoleon's army had been reduced to mere fragments of what it had once been. Disease, hunger, and the relentless Russian winter had taken their toll. The once glorious military machine was now a broken, shattered force, with only around 100,000 men remaining of the original 600,000. Napoleon, realizing that his campaign had failed, abandoned his men in an attempt to return to Paris. The army, now without a leader, staggered on, many of the soldiers left to die in the frozen wilderness. Lieutenant Henri Charpentier, a member of the Imperial Guard, recalled, "When Napoleon left us, we knew it was over. Some of us tried to make our way back to France, but we were lost. The roads were filled with the bodies of men who had given up. We were nothing more than shadows now, marching through snowdrifts, the war over for all of us. But we kept going, not for glory or for honor, but because it was all we knew." Napoleon's retreat from Moscow would go down in history as one of the greatest military disasters of all time. The losses were staggering. More than 400,000 men perished in the frozen wilderness, either through battle, disease, or the bitter cold. The Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility and marked the beginning of his downfall. The retreat was not just a military defeat, it was a profound personal tragedy for Napoleon and his soldiers. For those who survived, the memories of the horrors of that winter would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The battlefield, once a place of glory, had become a graveyard. Napoleon's empire, which had seemed so unassailable, was on the brink of collapse. For years afterward, veterans of the campaign would gather in Paris, speaking in hushed tones about the horrors they had endured. Private François Dumas, who survived the retreat, later shared his memories. "I remember the silence after the fighting stopped. The cold, the death, it was as though we were in a dream, a nightmare from which we could never awake. But we lived. We were the lucky ones, but there were so few of us left." The retreat from Moscow was a turning point in history, a moment that would echo through the annals of time as a lesson in the fragility of power, the relentless force of nature, and the human cost of ambition. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons to stay updated with more content. This content has been adapted from the powerful features of Polyspeaks for You, South Africa's leading accessibility software. Learn more at www.polyspeaksforyou.co.za. We invite you to support this meaningful dyslexic initiative, crafted and developed by an individual who personally understands the challenges of dyslexia.